Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with J. Robert Lennon for a discussion of his latest books, Subdivision, a novel, and Let Me Think, stories, in conversation with Elisa Gabbert. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved readers that we are able to make events like this happen. So thank you so much for continuing to show up for us week after week. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you'd like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section of this presentation, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copies of Subdivision and Let Me Think. If you already have a copy of the books or would like to contribute to the series and our store in a different way, I'll also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. And lastly, as you may have experienced during virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues might come up. If any technical glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and your understanding as always. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. J. Robert Lennon is the author of 9 novels, including the acclaimed Broken River, and 3 story collections, including Pieces for the Left Hand, one of my all-time favorites. His award-winning short fiction and book reviews have appeared in venues including the Paris Review, the Guardian, the London Review of Books, and Harper's, and his work has been widely anthologized in the Best American Short Stories, Best American Non-Required Reading, and Prize Stories, the O. Henry Awards. Tonight, he'll be joined in conversation by Elisa Gabbert, the author of 5 collections of poetry, essays, and criticism, including The Unreality of Memory and Other Essays, L'air bleu, or The Judy Poems, and The French Exit. She writes a wonderful and thankfully regular column for the New York Times, and her work has been featured in Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, the New York Review of Books, A Public Space, and many other venues. This evening, they'll be discussing John's latest books, Subdivision and Let Me Think, 2 mordantly funny, surreal, meticulous yet deliciously deranged offerings from the author who Kelly Link calls, quote, a master of the dark arts. Indeed, these books are magical. In both, subjects, both alien and familiar, navigate a mundane that is inflected by a lovelorn truck driver, a mysterious child, a watchful crow, a glass eye, a 6-fingered hand, those wonderful Lennon details that we hope will bewilder us even as they bring us closer to ourselves and the lives of these characters. Praise for both of these books has often embraced language common to the past praise of all John's work. Words like inventive, uncanny, compelling, and vibrant, all qualities that I think we all desperately need right now as we, as readers and as people, try to navigate this new, often disorienting quotidian we are immersed in. We are so excited to be able to host this event tonight and talk about these great works. Without further ado, I'm delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, John.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. That introduction was wonderful. I appreciate your comments on the book so much. I'm going to read brief excerpts of both of them. The story collection is mostly made of very short stories, and I'm going to read 2 of the very short ones. They're from a series of stories that are all called Marriage, and each one has a parenthetical elaboration to distinguish them from each other. And this is about a couple who are married, and they're horrible people who should not be married, and they treat each other very badly. And the stories are comedies. The first one is called Marriage, Coffee. She says, "We're out of coffee. I'm going out." "We're not out of coffee," he says. "I just bought coffee." "That stuff you bought," she says, "isn't coffee." "Respectfully," he says, "it is. It's the exact coffee we've been drinking for the past 5 years. You drink this coffee literally every day." "I haven't drunk it in ages." "Every morning," he says, "I brew a pot of this very coffee and pour some into a mug and bring it to you in bed. And you lie in bed and read, and you drink this exact coffee." "Well," she says, "I appreciate the gesture. I really do. But the fact is, I don't drink it. Just yesterday, I watched you drink it. You raised the mug to your lips and gave me a little wave. Yes, I raised it to my lips. Then, when you left the room, I got out of bed, went to the bathroom sink, and poured it down the drain. I don't get it, he says. You love coffee. Not this coffee, she says. I go to the coffee shop on 7th. They source their beans from small farms in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Then they roast them on the premises. The roaster is from Milan. He earns $75,000 a year. They grind the coffee in precision burr grinders and pour pure hot water over the grounds by hand. That's the only coffee I've drunk since 2011. Why didn't you tell me, he says. I didn't want to make you feel bad. But now I feel even worse. I feel like a fool. He goes on. The roaster, he says, from Milan. Yes. Is he good looking? Very, she says. Better looking than me? Of course. After a moment, he asks, are you sleeping with him? Only once, she says. He has a lot of sex. I'm actually surprised he agreed to it. It was your idea? She nods. How did that work exactly? You accepted the coffee from him and said, would you like to have sex with me? The roaster doesn't do the pour over. That's the barista. Don't you know anything? Anyway, I didn't proposition him at his workplace. That would be harassment. I did it in a bar. He says, was it one of those nights you said you were going out with Lisa? There is no Lisa, she says. I see. So I should stop buying this coffee then. No, keep buying it. You like it. Actually, he says, I don't. I bought it because I thought you liked it. I've been sitting in the kitchen every morning drinking this coffee because I imagined that you were lying in bed drinking it too. I figured even though we don't like to be together in the morning, we could at least drink the same drink. Actually, he says, I prefer tea or juice even. I'm more of a tea and juice man. Oh, that's so sweet, she says. Yeah. Do you want to come with me now? She says. You could meet Federico. I don't know, he says. You'd like him. He's kind of an asshole. Yeah? Yeah. This time, they go to the coffee shop together. I'm going to skip this one because there's too many swears. And then I will complete the short story portion of this program with this story called Marriage Whiskey. And I wrote this for the thank you, Deb. I wrote this for the beloved Pie and Whiskey reading series in the Pacific Northwest, and read this at one of their events in Missoula. So I have very fond memories attached to this disgusting little story. When he gets home, she's sitting on the sofa holding a bottle of whiskey. I've decided to try drinking, she says. Drinking, he asks her. Why? We're complacent, blandly happy. It's time for a change. We're not happy at all, he says. I'm sick of everything being comfortable and easy, she says, taking a deep swig from the bottle. I'm shaking things up. Things are very hard, he says. We live in an environment of complete emotional chaos. Don't you want a little risk in your life, she says, a little drama? There's no drama around here, she says, drinking. No, I don't. I don't want any drama. Have some, she says, offering him the bottle. No, he says. He's still standing by the door in his running sneakers, holding a briefcase. It's vile. Seriously, it cost $8. Are you drunk yet? He asks. Yes. Do you like it? That's not the point, she says. The point is that alcohol ruins lives. I'm trying to bring ruin down upon us. $8 is a small price to pay for that. We've been ruined for some time, he observes. He goes to the bedroom, takes off his shoes, and lies down. He reads some things on the internet about coping with an alcoholic spouse. Then he watches some videos about ghosts and some videos of people falling down and getting hit by things. He looks at some pictures of girls' breasts. He hears her climbing the stairs and entering the bathroom, and then he hears the sound of vomiting. He gets up off the bed, goes into the bathroom, and sits on the floor beside her. The room reeks of cheap booze. It's the smell of ruined lives. He pats her on the back as she throws up. Stop that, she says. It's annoying. I love you very much, he says. It's not me you love, she says, wiping snot and saliva from her face and gazing blearily into his eyes. It's my sickness. Okay. And this book is, if you liked Pieces of the Left Hand, I hope you will like this one. It also has a lot of small things in it, but also has a few Also has a few longer pieces as well. So it's slightly different. Okay, so Subdivision is a novel in which an unnamed narrator arrives in a small town that's only called the Subdivision. And she has amnesia. And she is staying in a bed and breakfast that is, the proprietors are two ladies. They're both retired judges, and they're both named Clara. But one of them goes by Clara, and the other goes by the judge. And they give her a map of the town so she can go out and look for a place to live permanently. But she doesn't know why she's there, and she doesn't remember her past. And through various strange encounters throughout the book, you eventually learn what her past is, even though she sort of doesn't really. Spoiler alert. I think that's the only thing you need to know. She also, just two more brief things. She buys a digital assistant, Alexa style digital assistant at a drugstore, and it begins to give her advice. And the other thing is she's being followed around by a crow. I don't know if the crow is in this scene though. So here in this scene, she's exploring the Subdivision and she's looking for an apartment. The house marked Jules on my map lay on the opposite corner of the Subdivision from the park, but it wouldn't be a terribly long walk, I thought. I decided to go all the way east, then south, to check out the edges of the neighborhood. Most of the streets in the Subdivision ended abruptly at a house or place of business, but some continued out into the rough terrain beyond and dead-ended there. There were dark, hazy hills in the distance, and between them and the Subdivision, dense woods. A weedy verge extended between the streets and the woods, passable on foot, it appeared, but unpleasant looking, with many rocks, irregular patches of ground, and burr-covered scrub. Eventually, I reached the road that, on the map the ladies had drawn for me, led toward the city proper. This road descended into a tunnel that burrowed under the Subdivision's easternmost street. If I peered into it, I could make out the light on the other side as the road rose to meet the weedy verge. But the road was closed, the tunnel entrance blocked off by a length of snow fence, and a sign marked danger. A backhoe was parked nearby beside a cluster of orange plastic traffic drums imprinted with a white prismatic stripe pattern. The pattern seemed to shimmer and undulate as my angle to it changed, making the drums appear somehow blurry to the eye. For all that, though, it didn't look much like much work had been done here for some time. The drums and digger were hemmed in by a skirt of dead leaves and other debris, and they were spotted with dirty splashes from some rainstorm of the recent past. Up at street level, I thought I could make out the city in the distance, an irregular series of blocky lumps, any of which could be interpreted as a parking garage, a church, or an office building. I didn't know when I would get around to visiting, but it wouldn't be today. When I came around the appointed corner and apprehended the Jules house, my heart leaped. It was adorable, a small, modern, freestanding home shaped like the letter L. The elbow of the house sheltered a cheerful brick patio, complete with comfortable-looking chairs and benches, and a charcoal grill, all underneath a large, colorful umbrella. A man was holding a garden hose and using it to spray the flowering shrubs that surrounded the house. He looked up as I approached and greeted me with a wave, letting the hose fall to the ground. "You must be the one Clara and the judge sent over," he said, extending his hand. I took it and we shook. He was tall, perhaps a few years older than me, and rather handsome, seasoned, but not worn or weary. His long face had a chiseled look, but his large hands were soft, and his broad shoulders implied strength. "Are you Jules?" "Yes," the man said. He gestured behind himself with an expansive wave of his arm. "I'm planning to leave the Subdivision for a time, and I need to rent my house." "It looks beautiful," I said. "Yes, it's a great house." He winked for some reason. "Would you like to come in?" "Yes, I would." The interior of the house was just as pleasing to me as the exterior, a tidy kitchen with everything in its proper place for a single person's efficient, comfortable sustenance. A living room with a plump sofa, a reclining armchair, and an agreeable view through 3 large windows of the hills to the east, the neighborhood to the west, and the streets to the north. An equally bright bedroom contained a king-sized bed and a spacious closet, and the bathroom was large and inviting and tiled in blue. The floors throughout were wood, and tasteful photographs and paintings of nature hung on the walls. It's very nice, I said. I'm interested. Excellent, excellent, Jules replied, rubbing his large, strong hands together. Let me just show you the backyard. I followed, trying to avert my eyes from his muscular, jeans-clad behind. He really was good-looking. Perhaps he would need to come back to the subdivision from time to time for business. He might want to stay in the house, on the sofa, or even in the bed if he wanted. I could make him dinner in the pretty kitchen, and perhaps we could chat on the sofa while the sun went down. My bag began to vibrate. I was alarmed for a moment, then remembered that Sylvia was inside. It probably needed to be charged again already. I ignored it. The backyard was beautiful. Bordered by roses, it featured a freestanding swinging bench, a fire pit, and a croquet court. On the low stone wall that encircled the fire pit, a crow stood, gazing up at us. An apple tree bore shining red-green fruit, though it wasn't yet autumn. Jules plucked one off a branch and crunched into it. I watched the little droplets of juice spray through a ray of sunshine. He smiled. Help yourself, he said. I reached up and took hold of an apple. Its branch was supple, and it bent with a faint creak. When it released the fruit, the branch snapped back into place in a flurry of verdant leaves. My bag vibrated. I ignored it. Jules was walking around the side of the house. Presumably, we would return to the front yard and discuss the terms of my lease. I couldn't stop thinking about the apple juice on his lips. Perhaps I should reach up and wipe it off with my thumb. Afterward, I might even flirtily pop the thumb into my mouth. Maybe life in town wouldn't work out for Jules, and he'd have to move back here permanently. He would be too ethical to evict me, though. We would have to share the space. A house this size probably didn't have a very large water heater. There would only be enough hot water for a single shower each day. It would likely become necessary to shower together. As we came around the side of the house, I turned for one last glance at the lovely backyard. I could already imagine myself painting my toenails there on the swing. My gaze, however, instead fell upon the western window of the living room and then out to the yard again through the eastern window. What I saw puzzled me. The living room appeared normal, with the sofa and chair as I remembered them, but as seen through both windows, the backyard looked different. The apple tree was dead, blackened, in fact, as though it had been partially consumed by fire. The fire pit and bench swing had been destroyed, their pieces scattered about on stony, weedy ground, and from the hills in the distance, smoke rose. The only thing that was the same, that is, between the winsome world I accept as real and the ruined one visible through the two windows, was the crow, which remained perched on the only persistent chunk of fire pit wall. It cawed as I watched, and I could hear it from around the corner. I stopped and took a few steps back to again see the yard firsthand. There it was, just as it had been moments before, with the lush grass, comfortable swing, and apple tree heavy with fruit. The crow stared at me, hopping on both feet in an agitated manner, flickering in and out of existence. And again, through the two windows, save for the crow, the scene appeared quite different. Oh, I see you've noticed the thing with the windows, Jules said to me, snaking an arm around my shoulders and leading me back toward the front yard. This was the closest we'd been, and I could smell his scent, sharp and smoky, as though he just built a campfire. Yes, what's up with that? I said, leaning my head gently against his smoky shoulder. I was still holding the apple I'd picked. Okay, so, Jules said, taking me by the shoulders, turning my body to face his and gazing smokily into my eyes. His eyes were intense and gray, a smoky gray, and I smelled smoke, wood smoke, tinged with other things, gasoline, melted plastic, seared hair and meat. This house was built in a probability well. Nowadays, such places aren't zoned for residential construction, but my house was grandfathered in. I see, I said, although I didn't. I reached up and stroked his cheek. It was hot to the touch, like a smoky ember from a fire. My bag was vibrating again, and the crow cawed in response, and I was beginning to get angry. Once I'd signed the housing agreement, I would return Sylvia to the drugstore. It was a cheaply made product, irritating and defective. Also, it had been insensitive to my life situation. I hated it. As for the crow, well. And these windows aren't event-tempered against narrative repolarization. You can't get windows like this anymore. There are too many manufacturing regulations. Yes, sometimes you'll see the future through them, or the past, or some alternate version of the present. but they really let the light in on sunny days, and they're easy to clean. That makes a lot of sense, I said, though it didn't. I was squeezing Jules's shoulders and upper arms with both hands now. He was so handsome and so smoky. I hazarded a glance at the west wing of the place, where I knew the bed was, and saw through one window into the bedroom, our bedroom, Jules's and mine, and then out the other window to the moonlit street where my preteen self stole away with my little sister, whom I had decided to raise on my own, away from the environment of selfish indifference our feckless parents had created. My initial reaction to the scene was annoyance. How dare these disturbing alternate realities interrupt my seduction of this beautiful, smoky man? In addition, the vibration from my bag was growing more intense and more urgent. The crow cawed and cawed. Jules was leaning down to kiss me. I wanted him, but I couldn't tolerate Sylvia's distractions even a second longer. Hold that thought, I said, and stepped a few feet away. I unzipped my bag and fiercely took up the vibrating cylinder. It had turned entirely red and was hot to the touch. Listen, I began. You can't just... Do not eat the apple, Sylvia said. Do not eat the apple. Do not eat the apple. I hadn't planned to, I said. I'm going to have smoky sex with this man. Do not touch the bakemono, Sylvia said. Do not touch the bakemono. I didn't understand what the device was trying to tell me, but the faintest sense of unease had begun to worm its way into my consciousness. This house is perfect. I'm going to take it, I said, and I'm going to fuck my landlord. You must not reside in a probability well, Sylvia said. You must not fornicate with the bakemono. I don't see why not. The bakemono will trap you. Do not eat the apple. Do not fornicate with the bakemono. I glanced over my shoulder to where Jules was standing, tapping his foot and whistling, his tail idly twitching. He looked terrific. He didn't have a tail, of course. I wasn't sure where I'd gotten that impression. Please leave this location. It is not safe. Just because it might be a burned up wasteland in the future, I argued, doesn't mean it's dangerous right now. You are in immediate danger. Please leave this location. Jules was getting impatient. His elongated snout was sniffing in frustration, and his hackles were up. I'm confused, I admitted. Please drop the apple and move to the street. Jules was coming toward me now. Smoke rose from his fur, and his haunches flexed as he made his way across the yard. I could hear with astounding clarity the beating of the crow's wings as it took flight from the backyard, crossed over the roof, and described a tight circle above us. I dropped the apple and began to back away. Quickly, please, said Sylvia. I ran. I could smell Jules galloping along right behind me, his chemical stink. His paws thumped the ground, and snarls and snorts escaped his throat. I clutched Sylvia desperately as though it were a baton in a relay race, one I had to win to save my life. Jules was literally nipping at my heels, the tiny teeth, the hot, wet nose. With a terrified cry, I leaped onto the pavement. Jules emitted a shriek of frustration. Panting, I turned. There he stood, on his hind legs, chattering and gnashing his teeth, his thin, black lips sputtering with gray froth. He began to pace back and forth at the property's edge, shaking and clawing the ground. I could see clearly now that he was actually some kind of badger. Behind him, the house appeared plain, unkempt, just a charmless shack that had fallen into disrepair, the very sort of place where a pathetic rodent might seek temporary shelter. Okay, I'll stop.
Hi. Hi, everyone. That was hilarious and delightful. Thank you for reading for us, John.
Thanks.
I'm so happy to be doing this. We did an event together when Broken River came out, which was so fun, back when things happened in Meat Space. And I remember that event really fondly. So I'm so happy to be doing this again. And I'm a longtime fan.
Oh, thanks. Likewise.
So I have a bunch of questions I want to ask you. These questions are more like paragraphs, so bear with me.
This will be more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, these are all definitely comments. So this one is going to bifurcate into two possible questions, and you can take whichever path you like.
Okay.
But when I started this novel, I was thinking a lot about the unconsoled, I think in particular, because you had just done this podcast, Lit Century, where you're talking about the unconsoled. I know you love it. I love this novel. And I saw a lot of similarities in the beginning where it kind of feels like, oh, are we in a dream? Is this a dream? Because the narrator has like no memory and therefore she seems to have no past. And it's kind of like when you try to recall a dream, you can never remember exactly where it begins.
Yeah.
And your dream self has no past, it just is. And so, so here's the two paths. On the one hand, I'm wondering if you were consciously kind of doing an homage to Ishiguro in any way, if dream fiction in general is a genre that you were thinking about when you wrote this, or you could just talk about influences in general and in particular non-fictive influences, because this novel is so game-like. I just kept wondering if it was like actually sort of something that you came up with while you were playing a video game.
I was playing a lot of video games when I came up with this, and well, the sort of germ of the idea came from I literally did stay at a bed and breakfast. I was doing a reading somewhere, and the college I was reading at recommended this place, and the proprietors were two retired women who were a judge and a nun. In the novel, I made them both judges because that's funny, and they had set up on the dining room table a giant puzzle, and they were clearly proud of it as like a feature of the bed and breakfast, that the guests should try to solve the puzzle. It could work on the puzzle anytime. And this idea of the hotel stay as a project that had to be completed, right? There was a task built into it. And I told a friend about this, and they were like, haha, that sounds like one of your novels. And I was like, yes, it does, doesn't it? It took me a while to figure out like what kind of novel it would be. As you said, Ishiguro is the Unconsoled. A lot of Ishiguro's books have a kind of dreamlike logic to them, but that one especially, and he uses it not explicitly to. It's not literally a dream within the text, but it has the sense of one, and he uses it as a way to uncover things about his narrators that his narrators don't know. So I kind of borrowed that technique. And then this idea of a world that seems infinite but is limited, and you get lost in it. And I'm talking about a open world video game. You get lost in the world. It feels very real, and then you stop, and there's a little note on the screen that says you can't go that way, or edge of map, or something. And there's literally a scene in here where she goes to the edge of the map. But what is actually going on in the book, I won't necessarily talk about. But it's about a mental state, basically. And she has to work on escaping it by working through her memories, essentially.
Yeah, I love those sort of dead end paths. It did remind me of the kind of like primitive text-based adventure games that I used to play with my brother when I was a kid. Speaking of games, another thing that reminded me of game playing was these sort of objects in the book. So I was just very interested in the things and the way that, sometimes it kind of seems like the narrator has to pick something up like it's a token or almost like a weapon, or it's going to give her some power later, like I'm thinking of the hilarious scene where she's holding a banana muffin the whole time, where she goes around the city.
I almost read that bit, but it was a little too long.
The second you you forget that she has a banana muffin, you're reminded that she's still holding the banana muffin. And there's another scene where she takes the crayon and puts it in her pocket, and there's just this strong sense that oh, she's going to need that later. And it made me think of, I'm going to read you this line from a little craft essay that Laura Vandenberg wrote.
Oh, great.
About the distinction between details and objects. And objects, she says, can be powerful generators of structure, character, atmosphere, and plot. So I just wanted you to kind of riff on the idea of objects and how you saw them working in this novel.
Oh, okay. That was the whole quote. So say the quote again.
It was just, objects can be powerful generators of structure, character, atmosphere, and plot.
Yeah, and I give this talk once called "How to Describe a Room." I think it's still on YouTube, and it was at the craft talk at the Colgate Writers Conference. And I'm really preoccupied with this idea of when you're writing and a character enters a space, you have to indicate the general nature of the space through detail, but you also need to show what is important in the space. And in a video game, it's very simple, right? There's like a light shining on it, or it has a little icon over it, right? Oh, here's here's a chest you can loot. Here's a quest object that you have to pick up in order to complete your mission, right? And in a way, a novel is the same. Certain objects have a special glow to them, right? We establish this rhetorically, rather than through, graphics, which don't exist in a text novel, but well, we could underline them, I guess, or put them in italics like Thomas Bernhard. But this idea of the object as, out in the real world, when you have a talisman, it doesn't actually have any power, right? It's metaphorical power that you have given it. It's your lucky rabbit's foot that you carry around, or an old photo that you keep in your wallet, right? You need to have it with you because in the plot of your life that you have generated, it's important, right? It's really a MacGuffin, but you make it important by thinking of it as important. And so this idea of, in a novel, the writer is the one doing that instead of you. And I feel like in this book, it's a first person book. So ostensibly the character is the author of it. And she doesn't know what she's doing, right? I know what she's doing, but she doesn't know I exist, but she sort of knows that I exist. She has a feeling I exist, So yeah, I really enjoyed using these objects. She'll often call things by their wrong names, or she'll identify things that almost exist in our world, but not quite in the same way. And
yeah, I was actually really curious how you kind of decided, if you did decide, or if it was whimsical. Like some things are real, very recognizable objects from our world, and others aren't. And sometimes there's a little bit of a twist. Like we talked before about the Newton's Cradle toy being called a Schwartzman sling. And when I was reading the novel, I was like, is that really what that's called? And it turns out not. I just didn't remember the real name. But like, how did you, is that part of your whole world building technique, thinking that like, oh, not everything can be real because then it will be too realistic?
The shtick in this book is the world exists for her. And it is created from, like a dream, it's created from her memories, which are inaccurate, right? So there's all this stuff in it that is drawn from her past, but has been warped in some way, including, the big things like the bakemono, what he means, who he is, right? But even small objects like the Newton's Cradle, which is, for people who don't know what we're talking about, it's like a desk toy you see on a businessman's desk with the hanging steel balls that click against each other seemingly infinitely. And she didn't know the name of it, but the world created a name for her, and she's like, oh, it's the Schwartzman's sling. There's another scene where she needs to buy a battery for a child's flashlight, and she doesn't know which it takes, so she just buys one of all of them, and then I just list all the batteries, and about half of them are completely specious, because that's the kind of, I think of these things as the kind of knowledge, or like the names of magazines that don't really exist, the kind of common knowledge that we think we know in real life, but if we're actually called on it, if someone says to you, is there a type of battery called a quick zap, you'd be like, maybe there is, I don't really remember. Is that real? D is real, right? But is triple D real? So I kind of wanted this world to exist very confidently based on bad information, basically. And often information that is colored by her. She doesn't want to face the truth about her life, essentially. And so the world is at first created for her to avoid it. And then eventually it closes in on her so that she can't ignore the truth anymore.
Yeah. So the other night, I was falling asleep, and I sat up, bolt upright in bed, and I had a phrase in my mind that I had to write down on a Post-it to ask you about. And the phrase was false solution. And it seemed very important to me as like a key to your work, because I was thinking about it in terms of this novel, but also in terms of, is it Loop or The Loop, the story that is in the New Yorker?
And it's in Let Me Think too.
Yes.
The Loop.
So in both, there's this kind of feeling that a character has gotten themselves caught in this kind of game-like situation that is bad, and if they somehow find the solution, they'll be able to get out of it. But compared to, say, Groundhog Day, where there's a real solution, you know, where it turns out like if Bill and Mary just like lives the perfect day, he can get out of the loop.
Yeah.
In your version of the loop, there's no way out of it.
Right.
you're stuck that way. And I feel that to be true of Subdivision as well. There's this feeling as you're reading, like, oh, if we can just solve the mystery together, because you sort of identify with the narrator, like we can get ourselves out of the situation. But I find that to be like a trap or an illusion. So yeah, this is definitely more of a comment than a question, but
yeah, no, and that story, and I owe our mutual friend Ed Skoog a lot for the ending of that story. So for people who haven't read it, a person gets caught living the same day over and over again, and like as Elisa is saying, never gets out. And I originally pitched it. It's a horror story, right? You're trapped for eternity. And Ed Skoog read a draft, and I was like, what's wrong with this? And he said, it's perfect, same ending, except she likes it. And I was like, oh my God. He said, she's a god now. And I realized that if I had her, I was thinking of fractals, right? That the deeper she goes into the one day, the more there is to notice. And then she can break down each detail and see more about that detail. And so she becomes the master of this day of experience that no human being is capable of, right? She's a god of that day. And suddenly I realized that was the end. He was exactly right. It's like the same stuff happens. It's just how she comes to see it. I won't, in the case of this novel, I feel like the puzzle is sort of solved. The literal puzzle gets solved, but see, the thing that I was going for was, and when my editor Ethan Izowski read this for the first time, he was like, this sort of works, but the reader knows what's going on like halfway through. And my response was, yes, exactly. That's where you're supposed to pivot from. It's no longer a mystery. Now it's just a mystery to her. So your attention goes to, you can't wait for her to get it, but she won't get it, right? And he said, okay, if you want to do that, then you have to lean into this a little. You have to let the world of the novel acknowledge that that's what's going on. So I had Claire and the judge
yeah,
say, hey, you've had the whole puzzle solved except for one piece for quite some time now. Why don't you solve it? Why don't you work on the puzzle? And, so she has to be, so the novel, the story sort of pushes the reader to the next way of perceiving the narrative. And then one's attention is on something else for the rest of it.
Yeah. No, I really enjoy how the novel makes her sort of dense. I mean, part of it is just like you get to feel a little smarter than the character, which, is not necessarily true when you're reading like Hercule Poirot or whatever.
But but think about like every like bad relationship you've been in or bad situation you got into, and when you escape it, when you solve the problem, when you extricate yourself from the catastrophe, you look back and you're like, why did I do that? You realize that you were dense, that we're always dense in the moment. That success in life is almost like 100% esprit d'escalier, right? It's like, it's always like looking back as you're leaving the events of your life, you suddenly realize what you should have said and how you should have handled it. This is sort of that.
And yet we make the same mistakes, because that's another phrase that I wrote down on a Post-it. Repetition compulsion. I feel like your fiction often has a scenario of one type or another. And another mutual friend of ours, John Cotter, mentioned this to me last night when we were talking about your work over dinner. just how frequently characters seem to kind of have to reinscribe things they've already done. So in Subdivision, that happens where, like, in this mental state, she's sort of living the events of her life over again, but in this jumbled, garbled way.
Yeah.
And of course, in Loop, when there's this actual repetition where she's doing the day over and over and over again. But there's other examples where there's this kind of mirroring or echoing. Yeah, and of course, it kind of leads one to think, like, is this about free will? Is this about determinism on some level? Can your characters make choices?
I mean, no, I'm in charge. What, are you kidding? Although I like that. I love that Nabokov quote where he's mocking the notion of characters taking over the story. And he says, my characters are galley slaves. And of course he's full of shit, right? But the thing about Nabokov is he's always like brilliantly full of shit. So, but it is a real thing. Of course, the characters do take over the story. So in a sense, like you've created an automaton that you've programmed it to act a certain way. But then it does start behaving in a way that you don't expect. And that what the writer has to do then is think, okay, is that wrong? Right? It's off the plan. Is this one of those moments of brilliance where I follow it, to a new place, an exciting new place? Or is it a deception, a self-deception? So in that sense, I guess characters have free will, but I don't know. I think people have free will. For every time you made the same mistake, there was a time when you never did that thing again. So I don't know. I think people can change, but the people in my books can't change.
Well, unless there's like a new edition 10 years from now, and
no, thank you.
You make some radical edits. No.
Like John Updike, obsessively keeping a library of his own books in which he's scribbling corrections in them. No.
Do you think of Subdivision, or really any of your novels, as science fiction on any level? Because sometimes they play with science fiction tropes, but often there's like another explanation, which kind of, as you said about this is really more about like a mental state versus like quantum tunneling. There's this whole sort of quantum tunneling thread in the novel, which maybe is a little bit of a red herring. Like, are we supposed to at first think like, oh, there's quantum tunneling going on, there's a probability hole, whatever that is, or later we might find out, oh, this is just really more like a dream world or self-denial. But yeah, like, do you think of your books as science fiction?
Kind of, yeah. As a thought experiment, I often say this to undergraduates, that all fiction is science fiction. Insofar as science fiction is a thing where the world of a science fiction novel is not like ours. It behaves in a certain magical way or scientific way, but a way that seems magical to us, that is fantastical to us. And you have to build that world so that it makes sense, that it feels like a form of reality. But that's what the Sally Rooney novel is as well, right? It's like these people behave only in a way that these people behave in a world that was made for them to behave that way in it. And so in Subdivision, I'm foregrounding that. I'm surfacing that part of the artifice. I'm putting it right at the surface. So this is super fake. And you can tell it's fake because the language is deliberately stilted. The dialogue is silly. Impossible things happen and crazy creatures are everywhere, right? And all the things we've been talking about are in it and that I just read. But it's really no different from any other fiction where the goal is always to create a world, even if it is. I've been reading, I mentioned Thomas Bernhard earlier because I've been reading this novella called The Cheap Eaters. And like most of his fiction, it's just completely cerebral. It is a narrator who's always repeating himself and rephrasing his own phrases and revisiting ideas in slightly different language in the service of talking about characters who are doing the same thing. It's these nested loops of cognition. And that's a science fictional world too, right? That has rules for how it works. just like an Isaac Asimov novel does, so.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to go to an audience question.
Great.
How does that sound?
I see them coming in over there.
Let's see. The first question we have here, your reading style is so excellent. I agree. When you were writing, do you ever read your work aloud in order to better understand the language of the dialogue?
Yes, I'm often muttering to myself when I'm working, and I take really long walks, and usually listen to music or podcasts on headphones. But sometimes when I'm working on something, I've got the file on my phone and I'll read it aloud to myself while walking through the cemetery or something, because I really am I hear especially when it's a first person novel like this. I've been writing more in the first person the past couple of years. I can really feel the sound of someone speaking it, and it's inspired by a form of spoken language. So yeah, I do that.
Here's another one that I love. It actually relates to another question I was going to ask you. So I'm just going to blend them together. So I was going to remark on the notes at the end of Familiar, which is the first novel of yours that I read, which I love. And there's this note at the end where you say like, oh, it's kind of a 9/11 novel. And it's not obvious when you read it. Like it doesn't signpost itself as a 9/11 novel. But I was thinking about that in relation to Subdivision and wondering if like to some degree, all your work is like a 9/11 novel, because like we're dealing with this post 9/11 world where there's kind of calamity after calamity, and events that in your novels are often events that change like the very fabric of reality, or they seem to. So the audience question, just so you can respond to both at the same time, was is it difficult to imagine or write for surreality when we are currently living in a timeline that feels distinctly surreal?
Yeah, no, it's not for me anyway, because every timeline seems surreal to me. Everything seems odd to me. Familiar came from I on actual September 11th, I got stranded. I was on a book tour. The whole book tour got canceled because of it. I got stranded in the Midwest and ended up driving a rental car. I got one of the last rental cars in Chicago to drive back to Ithaca, and I was alone, completely alone. All that was on the radio was 9/11 news. There were no planes in the sky. It was brilliantly sunny for the whole drive. It felt like it wasn't real. And initially with Familiar, I was like, the plot of Familiar is a woman sort of sidesteps into a different reality where a child of hers who had died did not die. And instead of her life being better, it seems like it's actually much worse. And she has to confront, like, am I a terrible mother? Is that why things happened? And originally I was like, yes, one of the worlds, 9/11 happened, and the other world, 9/11 didn't happen. And I was like, no, who cares? Who cares if 9/11 happened or not? It doesn't even mention 9/11. But the principle of the big event is the death of someone you're close to, and how that warps reality. And so it ended up, the smaller thing for me ended up being more powerful to write about than the big public disaster. So yeah, the question, I wouldn't say that I get a sense of satisfaction when crazy things happen, because they're often bad and I wish they hadn't, especially the pandemic, the entire presidency of Donald Trump and so on. But there is sort of a sense I get of like things clicking weirdly into place. Like, it's like, oh, I should have known that this stupid thing would happen. Because stupid things always happen. We have this baseline that we think we're supposed to be living at, but it doesn't really exist. It might exist for days at a time for certain people, but it's like there's endless unfolding calamity sort of morphing into other calamities. And I find it kind of fun to document that way of seeing the world.
Yeah. Place seems to be a crucial element of your work. Could you speak about that?
I think that's a good observation. I think it's true. But I don't know. One of my favorite books about that is Richard Hugo's writing advice book, The Triggering Town.
Oh, I love that book.
Yeah, it's a really good book. If you are a young writer or inexperienced writer and you want to get inspired, it's a really good book. It's sophisticated but also straightforwardly told. And he talks a lot about how place inspires things. I think that's true to me. I do feel like place is important to me, but I almost feel like any place is fine. There are places that are important in my life, but they're important because I went to them and did stuff there and met people there, or the people I love live there. But if you lived in Oxford, Mississippi instead of Denver, I would think of, oh, Oxford, where I hang out with John and Elisa, right? And that would be an important place to me. But instead, Denver's important because you guys and my brother are there, right? I feel like it's like we were talking about objects and how objects in a game that are important have a special glow. It's like those places are special to you and they might be great. They might be generally agreed to be great places, but not necessarily. I kind of like just driving to a shitty town and walking around and just like thinking, what would be it like to live in that abandoned church? And then I imagine like my exciting life of weird solitude in the abandoned church.
I've been reading a lot about Charles Wright recently, and he talks about how, so he thinks of himself as a Southern poet because he comes from the South. Then he went to Italy for a while when he was in the army, and he started writing about the South when he was in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went and taught in California. Well, first he went to Iowa, and then he went and taught in California for a little while. And when he was in California, he started writing about Italy. And it's just about like, yeah, the place gets that special glow like once you're not there anymore.
Yeah.
Here's another audience question that I find delightful.
Okay.
Would you ever consider trying to write a piece of straight realist fiction as a kind of Oulipo exercise, not allowing yourself to go weird?
I don't know what that is. I mean, I think my first, don't go read my first novel. But I think that was my attempt at that. It was more like giving myself an exercise of like, can you figure out how to write a novel? I mean, I was 25, so, but it almost accidentally became odd. Like when I grew up, I mentioned Isaac Asimov. I read all those, the robots books and the Foundation books and Arthur Clarke, and I read Stephen King. And I continued to read the worlds of science fiction and horror have become much more diverse and interesting. So I try to keep up with them, and fantasy as well. And I feel like that stuff is really in my blood. Like the books I think are best, when I recommend great novels for people to read, sometimes they have elements of those genres in them, but a lot of the time they're what you'd expect. They're sort of realist literary fiction, because a lot of that is very powerful to me on a level of artistic achievement, that I have great respect for the way those books are made. But when I'm actually trying to write something, I get really quite bored. And I always feel like my way of seeing real things is filtered through this sense of kind of constant peculiarity. It sounds like I'm boasting about that or something. I'm really not. It's just like, you notice a little interesting thing about the real world and you think, what if that little thing were huge? Let's write about that.
All right, so this last question we've got, I think is sort of related to that. This person says, I find your work hilarious, in all caps. I agree. I also find your work hilarious. Thank you. Do you feel like humor plays a role in your writing? Yeah, maybe you can just talk a little bit about how you think about humor. Are you trying to be funny?
It's really hard to answer that. I'm really glad that you and this audience member think that I'm being funny. And I have to admit, I crack myself up when I'm writing. It's not like I'm trying to tell jokes. I'm not trying to be funny, so to speak. But I end up with a turn of phrase that strikes me in a funny way. And I'm delighted at the dumb thing that I just did, is kind of the way the process goes. So that stuff really sneaks up on me. It's not like I think, oh, that would be a good, like I've rarely thought that would be a good comic novel idea. I think I've done that once. It's my second novel, The Funnies. And the premise is a guy is one of the children in the family that the Family Circus comic strip is written about. It's called The Family Funnies in the book, but it's like in this world, it's that. And his father dies, and instead of inheriting all the money, he inherits the comic strip, and he has to learn to draw. And in the process of learning to draw, he tries to get back together with his estranged siblings whose lives have been ruined by the comic strip. Apparently in real life that did not happen, that Bill Keene's family was not ruined by his comic strip.
They should have been.
But I thought, not only is that going to be funny, I'm going to call the book The Funnies, and it's going to be about comic strip gags is going to be a big part of it. So I was literally trying to put jokes. I was trying to put goofy set pieces in it. But I don't think it ended up being that much different from what I do now. Now I'm not trying to be funny. Like Subdivision isn't supposed to be funny exactly. It's really sad. But as I was writing it, I realized it was also ridiculous, and that I was doing that thing I was trying to do before, and now I'm doing it without trying. So maybe that's just a thing I do. I also find like books that are ostensibly serious, the parts of them that I remember the most are the humor in them. Like Crime and Punishment is a good example. The absurdity of all the stuff that happens in Crime and Punishment, the crazy conversations, or there's a scene in The Magic Mountain where Hans Castorp is shown this painting of the woman he loves, and he asks if he can hold it, and then it's like the banana muffin. I bet I got the banana muffin from this. For this whole long scene, he's just got this giant painting sitting on his lap. And that book is generally regarded as ponderous and profound, but that's what sticks with me, is this of the absurdity of this situation, one that is really sad, but also really hilarious. So I'd like to think that that's what I'm trying to do.
I found Subdivision very funny and fun, even though there's darkness in it, of course, especially sort of like roiling under the surface as you kind of piece together this woman's past. But it is just so fun to read. It does have this quality of like watching Clue or reading The Westing Game, which is like a novel I loved when I was 11. Yeah. So yeah, I absolutely love that quality.
Thank you. That's exactly what I want to hear. And I think this book, it's written in a deliberately straightforward style. And I really wanted it to be quote unquote easy to read. I wanted it to feel like the books I read in childhood, the sort of fantastical books from childhood, where you felt there was something, when I was a kid, I didn't really understand what I was noticing, but something about the complexity of the imagination of these people who were inventing a story for me, a kid. But there seemed to be more to it. It seemed deeper and stranger than what I was being literally shown. And that quality of there being more behind what you're being shown is really thrilling to me as a writer. And I want books to make me feel like a kid discovering something for the first time,
Yeah, and that's a hard quality to achieve, because like we get more jaded and things feel less novel when we're adults. So yeah, that's something very precious, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
are we done?
We're about at time. We're out of questions. Is there anything else you want to say?
No, I'm delighted. These are great questions. I really appreciate people. And a couple of the comments were just like nice comments, and I appreciate those coming in too. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for this fantastic conversation. This has been a truly delightful way to spend the evening.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about these incredible books and purchase Subdivision and Let Me Think at harvard.com. I've put the link in the chat a couple times. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your week. Keep reading and stay safe, everyone. Again, thank you for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good night.